So nice to see faces that I recognize from NYU and elsewhere. And I'm thrilled to welcome Paul N. and Paul R. This is an incredible work. We were chatting just before, and I confessed that last night the book fell off my night table onto my glasses, and I had to get my glasses readjusted this morning. So we know that this is a killer of a book. This is really
You're supposed to read it, Emily, not throw it.
well, it has dual purposes. Yeah. I'm going to start with a very general question to both of you about the genesis of the project, what sparked the new translation. Was it a collective process of work? I mean, I'm assuming it is. And also just to, as a little comment, translation is a very special, particular, oblique, transversal, cut-through theory. It produces its own weird effects. So take that with will. Yeah.
Maybe we'll test and see if Reitter can speak to us. Do you want to start?
I think I'm unmuted. Can you can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Working? Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm a little raspy. Sorry. And in addition to that, I have a tendency to prattle on when I'm on Zoom, so I'm going to really try to rein myself in.
Also in person.
Err on the side of brevity. So if you want more, just let me know, and I'll pick up where I left off. But I'm going to try to, again, keep things very economical here. So there were a lot of roads to this project for me. One of them was the classroom. I had been teaching Capital for many years, and being interested in translation, being a translator myself, I did a lot of backseat driving as I was teaching these translations of Marx to students who didn't have German. And I kept, I don't have much of a do-it-yourself streak, but when it comes to translation, that's sort of an exception. I kept thinking, well, somebody should do a new translation that conveys things that the existing translations don't convey. And eventually I thought, okay, I'll try it myself. I have enough in the way of preparation. I mean, nobody is really ever qualified to do this, but I have enough so that it doesn't feel completely ludicrous to give it a try. That's on the very micro level of the classroom. And then, of course, there were other things going on in the world, resurgent interest in Marx, which was exciting, developments in Marx scholarship that made a new translation seem that much more necessary, developments in the critical edition of Marx and Engels' complete works in Germany, this massive project that made available all kinds of materials that were extremely useful to us. And so all these things played a role as well. I suppose there's also the matter of midlife, wondering whether you're up to a challenge like this. So I'm going to stop there and let Paul give his perspective.
Well, one of the theorizations that doesn't happen so much around translation is what the translation does to the translator. This one is a little bit like swallowing an elephant. And it's amazing how well put together Reitter is after this. Really was. First of all, I'll just say a few laudatory things about him after making fun of him. This translation brings you Marx's lightness. You wouldn't have known that from the previous translation, especially. Marx's humor, Marx's irony. Reiter's a very ironic guy. And he could hear all the ironies in Marx, so they come through really amazingly. I think it was a big education for both of us swallowing this elephant. It's just enormous, and it has every possible style in it. So if you specialize in Dostoevsky, I don't know, maybe there's 3 styles in Dostoevsky. Is Dostoevsky flat? Maybe a little bit. I don't know, maybe not. But Marx has 20. He tells jokes when you least expect it, like the commodity that's being sold through the first few chapters is the Bible. What do they sell it for? To buy schnapps. This comes through a lot better in this translation. And I think it brought to us, it made us into critics of capital in a way that we weren't before, and particularly because of the scholarship that changes the reading of the first 4 chapters. That is the scholarship called value theory. It was really important for us in doing this. It seems to be the breakthrough that brought everyone back to Marx's non-revolutionary project, taking this book and making it. So here's the theory. Translation of this book, after a lot of really interesting work on it, teaches you that it really doesn't lead to revolution. Sorry to say. I think of it as the most pessimistic book ever written. And that does something to you when reading it. You begin to see there's no way out.
Okay. We will come back to that. Another question is, did you see this project as similar to comparable, fairly recent attempts to unseat standard editions? I'm thinking of Adam Phillips's Penguin Freud with the different translators. And they used non-standardized what had been the Strachey standardization of ego, id, superego. They played around with that. Or Christopher Prendergast's Penguin Proust, which also used different translators. So was there almost a kind of a plan here and you mentioned the literary, and Keston Sutherland in his book called Stupefaction, which has some very interesting comments on Marx's jargon, and he reads it as as a work of literature, as a satire. It's a form of satire. He says that people constantly miss that. And you mentioned, both of you, that you were sensitive to the humor and to the ironies and to, there are incredibly rich notes in this edition, just so you know that it could be like a separate book, and you'll make some little rabbit hole comment like about a phrase which I wouldn't have picked up at all, that is a Goethe quote from the Elbkönig, which is this amazing, if you haven't listened to it, is it Schubert's version? Listen to it on YouTube tonight. And this set me off into one of these ecstasies of association. But the point is that people weren't, part of the interest of this slightly unstandard approach is to really bring out the voicings that you just mentioned, the style, the variation of style, and also this incredible asides and wealth of literary reference. So anything you might want to say about that?
Well, I follow the Freud retranslation project a bit more carefully than the Proust project. And I suppose that in some ways, the circumstances here might be a little bit more favorable because the Freud standard translation, which everybody talks about as the standard translation, is this really revered thing. And if you read Adam Phillips' essay in the London Review of Books, where he talks about the various strategies that he cooked up for this project, there's a lot of pressure there, it seems, to avoid taking on the standard edition directly. And one wouldn't want to do that. One wouldn't want to question its value, its greatness. So we need to do something else. We need to be different all the time. And the existing English editions of translations of Capital, I have considerable respect for, but I don't think that they have anything like the status of the Strachey translation of Freud. And so it was a bit engaging them in conversation, felt a bit freer for me. And there were also, as I said, there were some things that felt fairly straightforwardly necessary in a way that maybe Phillips, it wasn't so much the case with Phillips. At least that's not what I get from his introduction. So there were, in the existing English translations of Capital, there are some areas of conceptual imprecision. And that to me feels like a significant problem. It doesn't make them bad translations, but it makes it more difficult to follow the development of Marx's concepts as he unfolds the value form. And that's an important thing right now for readers of Marx. And so if you can make the conceptual architecture more precise in a translation, that's a fairly compelling justification for new translation. I don't think that Phillips had something like that. And so it felt, again, a little less difficult to proceed here than I think it was for Phillips. And I think as a result...
Am I cutting you off?
Well, I just wanted to say one last thing. Now you all know what I was talking about when I said that I have a tendency to prattle on when I'm on Zoom, but I'm going to just say one very quick last thing. And, as far as I can tell, the retranslations of the Freud works overseen by Phillips have not been hugely successful.
Are you done?
I'm done.
I want to add only something about this book, which is surprising given how much people refer to it, and revolutions have been thought to some degree in reference to it. The Latin American philosopher Enrique Dussel once calculated that this book was about 1/72 of the Capital Project material. So different than the Freud texts, which were completed for publication. This was completed for publication, but he went on revising it for another 15 years in notes, in a French translation. And even inside of the text, although he's looking for something like you could call a scientific vocabulary, a terminology, it's very much information while he's talking. So he'll call things value form, and then he'll call them form of appearance. And you don't know how appearance exactly fits with value form. The prose unfolds, and you can elucidate it by work. But he had not got there to a fixed vocabulary. And I think what happened with the translation that was made at the time of the New Left for certain political purposes, and what happened with the reception of it, especially in people like Harvey, I'll mention him, very good reader of Marx, really interesting character, but the terms really ossified. And they are not ossified here. Marx is looking for the way to do this and wasn't always sure that he had got the right words, that he had got the right phenomena. The reports were coming in. He was constantly reading to correct himself.
Fantastic. So yes, we've been talking about editions. So just for the audience's interest, there was a Moore Aveling, Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling translation from 1887. Aside, Aveling was a pretty dastardly guy and they left out Eleanor Marx, the daughter, who worked on this, and he was the translator of the first English translation of Madame Bovary. So, then there was an 1890 Engels edition. Engels called it the Bible of the working class, and he really wanted to make it more accessible to working people. There was the Ben Fowkes edition that you were talking about, with an introduction by Ernst Mandel. That was the Penguin in association with New Left Review. Full German and mega edition, 1972 on, 23 volumes. Robert Young called this, it was a palimpsest of different books and drafts in 2 languages, all different ways, in different ways, the originals. And he's referring also to the Jules, is it Roy or Roy? I don't know, it's R-O-Y.
R-O-Y.
And this French edition was important because Marx supervised and kept rewriting Capital over it and in it, so it becomes its own thing. And then, Althusser, who gave us another kind of view of it in Le Capital, where he talks, he wants to make it pure theory, or is accused of this, of just pulling out the theory. So you got kind of Engels impulse on one hand and the Althusserian tradition leading in the other direction. So that's just a little background. And I'm going to try to wind down soon, but I have a kind of guerrilla set the scene for Marxist theory today, which you alluded to, Paul, in terms of, at both Pauls, in terms of the landscape of its reception. You know, what does it mean to do capital, volume 1 now, at this time? It lands in a very particular way. And so we're in the midst of discussions of distributive injustice and inequality, income inequality. Wendy Brown, in her incredible introduction, refers to the uneven spectrum of opulence, comfort, poverty, and desperation. So, and that's, the introduction really is great. Did you want to jump in?
Maybe it's worth saying what this book is a little bit. Maybe we can't take for granted that people have read it. Actually, you haven't read it until you've read this one. But I can say the way it was taken in a certain past, it was taken as an attack on capitalists in many of its pasts. And the new version that people have been working on that I find the most compelling, and we tried to bring out in this translation, tries to expose capital, a system, as what Marx calls in chapter 3, an automatic subject, which is the only subject of history. If you read this book following new scholarship, you find that there's this tremendous impersonal machine or organism, depending which analogy you use, and he uses both, that has us as its appendages and technology as its internal development motor. And fighting capitalists won't get you anywhere. Well, it might make you feel better. And it might make the working day shorter, which it did. If you read chapter 8, which you may know is 100 and some odd pages long, about fights in the 19th century over the working day, you'll find that it really does make a difference to change legislation, to unionize, etc. But the new capital, I think, for what I am thinking of as, I'm sorry, a 1,000-year reign of capitalism, talks about the automatic subject and the ways in which you are objectified by it. So that's what I think the new translation gives you access to, or doesn't tilt you towards class struggle as the surefire way to get out of it. Certainly class struggle is a feature of history, a feature of the theory. Classes are formed around what Marx calls the capital relation. The core of the book. This is what you learn that drives the machine. The core of the book is extortion. That the means of production are held back and the workers have to go to work in order to use them. So even more than exploitation, which makes you fired up against the people exploiting you, there's this extortion that even capitalists are not super aware of. And the other thing you learn in the book, which comes out more, I think, in this edition, which is not pointed towards class struggle in that way, is that, I forgot where I was going. What do you learn from this book? It's not pointed towards class struggle in that way. It'll come back to me. Sorry, that was a big build up to something.
Well, class struggle is complicated in the current landscape because there are different modes of intersectionality, of fractured solidarities, a kind of identity politics driven approach to class, which is very far from this book. So did either of you sort of have to translate that in some way, or was that partly because it's not that in Marx's time? How do you, that gets us into the nuances of historicism around language usage too.
Just before we get to that, I remembered what I was going to say, which is the kind of impossible struggle would be to replace the system. He says clearly that the only way to get rid of exploitation and extortion is to not have this system. That doesn't mean simply resisting capitalists. So it leaves you with a big question. On your question, Paul, do you want to take some air.
We were working on this translation during the summer of 2020, a moment, obviously, of racial reckoning in this country. And of course, it made us think, I think, even harder than we otherwise would have about certain topics in the book, Marx's treatment of slavery, some of the terminology that he uses, how to proceed there. And we tried to put in some contextualizing notes there to talk about Marx's views on slavery and where they were with regard to other progressive views at the time, and ways in which they feel now inadequate. We didn't go that far in talking about the discussion of the extent to which Marx neglects race in talking about domination, and that's a fundamental failing of the book. But that is, of course, a question, and it's something that we are totally interested in discussing, prepared to discuss. But these issues were definitely on our minds as we were doing the translation, and we decided ultimately to use Marx's language to preserve terms that now seem, I think, to most people kind of offensive. Most of the time when Marx uses these terms, he's not meaning to be disparaging. It's pretty clear from context. He's just using the going terminology of the time. But slavery is a difficult issue for him, in part because so much of his argument depends on the idea that modern capitalism requires freedom, requires a class of people who are free in two senses, free to do what they want with their labor power, but also free of anything other than their labor power, which means that they're forced to sell their labor power for subsistence wages or less. And a major theme in the book is the illusion of freedom under capitalism, or the way in which freedom and compulsion go together in capitalism. And so slavery in a way is a problem for him, the persistence of slavery in the modern moment, and how there can be a capitalist version of slavery. And so he treats it to some extent as a theoretical problem to be solved. And you could say that that's maybe not his finest moment in the book. To give you a sense of some of the things that we were dealing with there, and obviously you can look at how we frame this and tell us whether you think we did a decent job in handling this challenge.
I noticed you rendered. I thought it was really, it's an important correction and a great translation, that primitive accumulation in the more translation was ursprünglich. And it's primitive is not the word. It's complicated because the concept links to colonialism, but you translate it as original accumulation. And subsequent translations said previous accumulation. Each of these is enormously different. So I don't know, Paul, do you want to explain that one a little?
It's worth saying that the German word, I think, is closest, if you can say that about languages, to original. It doesn't mean you would use it in the places you would use the English word original. But Marx is using it, Marx is quoting that term from the political economists who claim that the resources that started up capital were a different form of accumulation and were just kind of lying there and people just picked them up. That's the implication of original. This is why he calls it so-called original accumulation. The problem with primitive is it substitutes another kind of questionable word for the original questionable word of the political economist that he was sending up, that he was critiquing, that he was ironizing. He certainly doesn't think it's original. He thinks it is absolutely a product of its historical moment. What is he talking about with original? He's talking about the way mainly agricultural workers were dispossessed of their lands under feudalism to make them available, both the land and the workers, for capitalist processes. They then had no choice but to go to work for a wage. For him, this was not original. It was an original sin, in a sense, of capital, but it was bloody, it was calculated, it used every means that was at rulers and capitalists' disposal: law, armies, police, burning things down. It was a terribly bloody history. So original is really in quotation marks there, no matter what. Paul, do you want to add something?
Yeah, this is one of, I think, the funnier moments in the book, where he goes through the origin stories in political economy, classical political economy, about this original accumulation and how it was presented as an idyllic process. And he then, of course, goes on to document at great length how it was anything but that. It's also, I think, interesting to note that this is the movement of the book. Marx starts out talking about the commodity. What is the commodity? Commodity, in the first place, is a use value. And you go from there to this story of original accumulation, as Paul said, this extremely bloody story involving the criminalization of vagrancy, forcing people who had been expelled from common lands to become proletarians willing to work 12, 14 hours a day and longer. This was not, as Marx emphasizes again and again, a natural process. He said it had to literally be whipped and branded into people. And so that's, I think, if you haven't read the book, this is what you are. This is what you have to look forward to if you do. This movement from a high level of abstraction in talking about the commodity and value and these other basic concepts, to this very, very richly material history of primitive accumulation, or excuse me, original accumulation in the last chapters. Just
to say what's important about accumulation in general, Marx actually made a change when he got to writing volume 1 from texts like the Grundrisse, which he had tried to write about 10 years before. What he was trying to lay out was this drive to accumulation. In fact, he took out a chapter and put in the later chapters on accumulation, because that seemed to be actually what was causing a lot of the suffering in capital. Not just that you were being exploited, but your exploitation had to increase in order for capital to expand. The drive to accumulation started to be the idea that was driving him. But turns out that original accumulation, so-called original accumulation, is the way that the difference between original accumulation and capitalist accumulation is that in capitalist accumulation, there's the fiction that you're paying someone back the equivalent of what they've given you. And in so-called original accumulation, they just do away with that fiction altogether. So slavery, chattel slavery, would be a form of so-called original accumulation. They don't claim to be giving anything back. They're taking and taking and taking and taking.
Now that we're into untranslatables or tricky untranslatables, I thought we would take a little dive into a couple of terms that is particularly fascinating. There's a triple-decker sentence: nothing is left over except the same ghostly objecthood, a bare, gelatinous blob of undifferentiated human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. So when this phrase comes up several times. It's not a unique one. It's on page 16. But okay, so a bare gelatinous blob.
I'm teaching a big lecture course, and the students love bare gelatinous blob. Paul, they love it.
But needless to say, blob is not in previous translations. And so this is an example of having some fun, taking some liberties, but it's also a very serious, really important issue here, and I'll let you expand, but just very quickly, there's also, it's this substance which, you know, in your notes, but also I was playing around with it more. It's basically the kind of, it's galerta, it's bone, it's stuff that was boiled down or into kind of a jello and then added as an additive or condiment to other dishes.
Another reason you didn't want to live in the 19th century. Galerta, it's kind of like what we would call suet.
Yeah.
And Marx uses this as the analogy, I guess, the image that makes graspable how abstract labor is formed from particular labors. You take all the different particular labors, you write on media theory, I write on Marx, you curate exhibits, you do tech, and you put it all together and you get labor, which is like all boiled down to be just its gelatinous blob. It was a stroke of genius, I have to say, the gelatinous blob, Paul. Because you couldn't really get it from the previous translation, the visceral sense that this is something you wouldn't want to eat.
It's often boiled animal substances, meat, bone tissue, lichen, starch, algae, slime, moss, pectin, and jellies. But
That's capital.
but it's actually something even more horrifying because the way it's being used, if I'm not mistaken, is that's what happens to workers. They become, and they are vampirized by capitalists. They are eaten. It is like they are boiled down basically as substance and ingested. And so it's a very gruesome, satirical, vampiric moment in the text. Would you agree?
Totally agree. We could say there were not horror movies before capitalism or something like that. It is a kind of a horror text. For those of you who have read it, it takes a lot from the Gothic genre and uses it to put this across. Interestingly, volume 2 and volume 3 don't have any of that. So they're very dry, but really fascinating, but very dry. Paul, do you want to add to the gelatinous blob?
I certainly think that it resonates with that rhetoric of vampiric activity in capital, or capital's essentially vampiric nature, that it comes to life by drinking living labor, and the more living labor it drinks, the more it comes to life. It's a dead thing that does this, and certainly becoming a galerta, this is not generally a good thing. And here Marx is talking about the fate of human labor in a way under capitalism. This is something that goes only for capitalism. This system, this regime of value, that the particular qualities are abstracted away in this way, which is what allows for large-scale commodity exchange. And it's also, I think, important to note that for Marx, one of the major deformations in capitalist society is that this form of labor whose particular characteristics have been abstracted away, this form of labor that's been made into a galerta, this is the directly social form of labor under capitalism. And I think that if you miss that part, and you really only get that by following the value form part carefully, then it's hard to appreciate what Marx is doing in the fetish section in the last part of chapter 1, where he really kind of lets loose with not the rhetoric of vampiric, but the rhetoric of the occult, tables dancing on their own accord, and this sort of thing. But I felt that with galerta seemed to me to be a very strong and striking word. The movement from gespenstig, which means ghostly, to galerta is very dramatic, right? Galerta is the opposite of ghostly, something that's ethereal and non-material. Galerta, something produced from bone marrow, is extremely material. It called out for something a little stronger than gelatin, which would be one way to translate that. And so I came up with this formulation that felt fairly striking, and to really mark that movement. And now evidently Yale undergraduates are getting tattoos of gelatinous blobs.
Gelatinous blobs. What does it look like? They keep asking me. And just to say why this is important, the peculiar thing about this book is that, you know, the revolution hangs or falls on how you translate these things. Marx was clear that abstract labor was his difference from Ricardo and Smith, from classical political economy. They thought a worker, these good workers, they were putting all their good essence into a product, and then it was getting traded for another product with a good essence. There's no good essence, it's a gelatinous blob, because your labor is compared to everyone else's. It's abstracted, it's averaged, it's homogenized, and it no longer looks like you. Nothing you do will change the fact that however good you are at making, let's say, gelatin, when you go to trade that gelatin, it will be compared to what it takes to make pencils or cars or anything else that might be found wanting. That's the difference that capitalism makes. So having a gelatinous blob there is the difference that makes the difference.
And this is how we relate to one another under capitalism for Marx, through these gelatinous blobs. What kind of a world is that? He's asking basically, is this, you know, is this really how we want things to be?
Paul, you mentioned that it comes right after gespenstige Gegenständigkeit, which brings us, as you mentioned, into the world of ontology, ghosts. Could you say, I mean, these are the ghostly objecthood is something that is a huge one here that you've been already alluding to. And as you mentioned too, it leads into the fetishism, famous fetishism section. So maybe you could get us onto this track of, you know, the status of the ghostly and the haunted object, these spirits that keep getting conjured in this vocabulary and linked to the choice of Charles de Brosse's fetishism concept from the Portuguese trading term paitico.
So this is a very central paradox, or really oxymoron, for Marx, that under capitalism, Paul talks about it as a quasi-metaphysical substance. I think that's a good way of talking about it. It rings true for me. It's this very peculiar substance that you only have under capitalism. A social substance is another way that he talks about it. And it's non-physical. It's not a physical thing, but it behaves often like a physical thing. And it comes to seem as natural to people as a physical thing, because it behaves that way. And so Marx talks about it in, well, as we've already seen, very material terms, even as he, again, marks that it's a social thing, and you know, it can just disappear, a commodity that people don't want anymore, that loses its use value. If it's a table, it's still going to look like a table, but its social character will be dramatically transformed. Its value will just basically disappear. It will no longer have that. However, value, again, for Marx is as real as the material side of the table, and, you know, easily as consequential. And if you translate, so he uses this term Gegenständigkeit to talk about value. And Gegenständigkeit, it is built off of the German term for object. The German term Gegenstand is a translation of the Latin term. And so he's talking about something that's not a physical object as having the status of a physical object. That's the paradox. It has just as much reality as that. And if you don't have that in mind, if you don't understand that Marx is talking about something other than objectivity in the sense of something that just exists, then it's very hard to make sense of sentences in the fetishism section where he talks about how the social characteristics of labor are reflected back as people as objective characteristics of the labor products they produce. What does that mean exactly? If you don't, if you're thinking of objective just in the sense of, you know, well, it's an objective characteristic, it's something that objectively exists, because social characteristics objectively exist too. The contrast is that they're objective in the sense of having objecthood, except they're not actual physical characteristics he's talking about there. And so that's why it seems very important to translate this as something other than objectivity, this Gegenständlichkeit term. Another reason to do that is that Gegenständlichkeit, like Gelehrte, is a term that brings a lot of attention to itself. It's not an everyday German term, whereas objectivity is sort of an everyday term. The first translation, the more Aveling translation, they just translated Gegenständlichkeit as reality, which takes you, I think, even farther from what Marx has in mind here. And
It's really true. I'm cutting him off again. Sorry, Paul.
no, please do.
I just wanted to give a context for why this is important. Imagine you go to a psychoanalyst. In some ways, Marx is positioning himself as your capital analyst. You go to a psychoanalyst, you lie down on the couch, and they say, all right, I'm going to tell you about the unconscious. Well, you might not come out of that much better than you went into it. But that's what Marx is doing for your experience in capital. He wrote this book, The Grundrisse, which was a total mess, in which he explained everything in Hegelian terms. Good to go back after you read this. Then he thought, I should start with the experience that people have as subjects under capital. What's their first experience? Well, they know what a commodity is. What kind of thing is a commodity? It has a kind of unconscious. You are unconscious of the fact that when you are dealing with commodities, you're dealing with both their particular characteristics that make them useful to you, that the screen is swipeable, that whatever it is, and the fact that they have value, which you can't see, but you have a kind of value sense. He just wants to make apparent to you your value sense, and that, in fact, capital, unlike other social systems, is metaphysical. It tells you there's this thing in your things that you can't see and you can't touch, but it makes you do things, like not throw out your iPhone when it frustrates you because it's valuable. You think, well, I could get some money for it on eBay. That is the spider sense of value that's there in the background. And actually, Paul's translation is the first one to show that Marx is saying, as he was wont to do to Hegel, well, there's really no need for metaphysics, except that capital preys on your need to this other level of invisibility that pushes you around.
I just want to add too that there is a very basic ethnographic subtext here, which is that it comes from the vesting of an anima in the object that was, goes back to the historical trade with votive objects that was considered, these were trivial things, they were trifles, they were idols, but the Portuguese got special permission to trade in this currency. And in a sense, the whole question of Christian theology gets transposed in the Marx situation. The invisible spirit are the hands of the workers. It is labor which is still creating this, anima that is haunting the object. So there is that, in a sense, that dimension to it, which is part of a cultural colonial history.
I think that's right. And he never tired of using religion to skewer everything as the kind of silliest way to deal with things. I'm sorry for those people who have those beliefs. The priest who sells the Bible for schnapps, or the fetish, which is interesting, does have a colonial history. It's a deeply racist term. But Marx, of course, was using it against the European capitalists.
Yeah.
Everyone in the system who he was claiming were actually ceding authority, not doing a cultural practice that was enriching for everybody, for example, as maybe happened in so-called African animistic religions. They were ceding authority to things. That only fetishism was happening with the capitalists.
So in the old Aveling Moore translation, a commodity appears at first sight a very trivial thing and easily understood. Its analysis shows that it is in reality a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. What did you do? I noted it here. Obvious trivial thing. However, when we analyze it, we see that it is very intricate, full of, I love this, metaphysical quibbles and theological quirks. Now that's a big, for me, I'd almost like memorize the original, the metaphysical niceties and so I read that and I went, whoa, that seems outside the box, and just curious what went through your minds when you made the quirks and quibbles. Not that niceties means very much either, but somehow.
I remember doing that basically together, that translation. And Paul had a lot of input on on translation
You're gonna
decisions.
blame me for this. I can't remember either. I have no idea.
You're on the hook.
It was closer to the German.
I remember that so the German term is grillen, and it has to do with more than niceties, peculiarities, quirks. Basically, that was the term that felt like it best evoked.
This is Marx being ironic and minimizing, because these are not just quirks and quibbles, right? This is a whole realm of mysteries that you're going to have to penetrate by reading the book. So maybe I think we thought that diminished it enough so that you could see that it was a joke.
Yes.
And that goes with but the moment the table begins to act as a commodity, it metamorphoses into a sensuous, super sensuous thing, another big departure from other translations, with a redundancy in there. The sensuous, super sensuous thing. I absolutely love this, but I was very curious to hear, if you had some discussions of that.
Sometimes the road rises to meet you, and you do a very basic translation, and because of the translation context that other people didn't do this, it seems like I guess an innovative translation. But there was a place where we really followed the German very directly. The German is sinnlich, übersinnlich, and for some reason the other translators kind of wrote around that.
Yeah,
even though you don't
transcendent.
Yes, you don't have to.
They also didn't have the project to make this ghostly layer visible. I think the project was to bring it down to earth, but Marx can't really bring it down to earth until you understand that you're living in a ghostly world and at the behest of ghosts. So we really tried to bring that up.
And also,
it's hot in here. It's really hot here. I remember this room. This is a hot room.
The problem is when we switch on the AC, it gets very noisy, so then you don't hear so well. So
But if the audience is dead.
Well, we're also, I should add, more committed than the other editions to conveying the neologistic character of a lot of Marx's formulations. And sinnlich, übersinnlich, that's a kind of neologism that he has there that I think really brings out something that Paul mentioned earlier, just how much in progress this is, how Marx is trying again and again and again to formulate effectively what this value thing is. There was a lot of change from the first edition in 1867 to the second edition in the terminology around value. And, you could say there are some ambiguities there, some significant ambiguities, maybe some ambivalence on his part about which direction he wants to go. There's a pretty fundamental debate in Marx studies about where value comes into being. Does it come into being at the moment of exchange, when this abstraction occurs, the result of which is the gespenstige Gegenständlichkeit, the thing left over? Or does it come into being during the labor process itself? And, logically, the exchange process makes a lot of sense, but Marx often talks about value in a way that suggests that it is being produced during the labor process. He talks about the creation of value, which suggests that it's not simply the product of a reduction, of an abstraction. Anyway, I'm not here to solve that problem. I'm just pointing it out as an effect of this terminological movement in Marx that we had to reckon with and that we tried to preserve.
So Paul wrote an introduction to this text as well as Lindy Brown. It's called Marx. It's not necessarily called, but it has a lot on Marx's anger. And it gives a very wonderful snapshot of who Marx was. Who's Marx? Where did he come from?
he was always moving. He kind of became Marx when we're writing this book and the manuscripts in the 1860s, the Marx that we know. But there were many Marxes. There's the Marx of the Manifesto. And my attempt to speak to some of the angry people in this country right now was to start with Marx's anger and show where it can go. That is to writing a big, theoretically complex book instead of storming the Capitol. We'll see. We did get it out just in time, though. Marx will tell you, if you read the preface to the previous draft, a contribution to the critique of political economy. The preface to that, which was written in 1859, which has in it, I recommend reading this text, it's not in here. It has in it the most beautiful exposition of historical materialism, even though he doesn't call it that. People make their history, etc. In that, he lost my train of thought again.
Well, who was Marx?
Oh, Marx, right.
And he was a Jewish guy.
He was a Jewish guy. That's what you wanted me to say? I forgot what I was saying with that, but in any way, to go back to the Jewish guy.
Yeah.
He was a funny Jewish guy whose parents converted because he had to, his father had to make his way in the civil service. And this put Marx in a position in which he had a kind of double disappointment, as I think of it. He had the disappointment of being an emancipated Jew that couldn't really move on in society, even though he was converted. And he had the disappointment of someone who was living in the aura of the French Revolution, where the reforms had been promised in Germany and had even come a little bit and then were all rolled back. So here he was, 18 in college, fighting duels, don't ask, and dealing with the Hegelians, again. And he didn't know what to do. He was not going to become an academic. So he started working at a newspaper. That happens to a lot of my students. I don't know why, but they don't get politicized like Marx. He started working at the Rheinische newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung. And there he encountered, between that and his friend Engels, he encountered a couple of bits of real data. First, he encountered the way the poor were being treated by the Prussian government, by the Rhenish government in particular, which was in line with Prussia. They were being, their common areas were being closed off again, and they were being denied access to wood and other things that used to be free. And he got pissed. That was one. And the other source for that was Engels' report from his father's factory in Manchester, The Condition of the Working Class in England, which Marx read, and he was like, this is what real social life is like. It's not what Hegel said, that everyone mediates everything between the people and the parliament and the king. It's that people are not getting the benefit of the economic developments that are happening. And so he went from being, a bit of a hothead, but I think also for cultural, social, and historical reasons, what it meant to be a Jew not really fitting into German society. We can say thank goodness for this because we have Marx. To finding an object of his ire, which was the condition of the working class in general. And then he started to get pissed at a lot of people in turn. First the Hegelians, then the political economists. But his pissed offedness was being refined slowly but surely in the direction of critique. So I trace the movement from anger to critique, which I hope will be a lesson to us.
I think we should wind down and have some questions from the audience. Maybe one last thing to keep in our mind. Many have argued that, that there is a Marx language, and that it is the language of critique. It's the preeminent language of critique. That there's, of course, Kant, but, this is really, as it's larded with a kind of complex irony and satire and deep anger, it's something really people haven't seen before. So how do you, I guess my last question, how did you wrestle with that rhetorical complexity and the sort of importance of conveying this as a language of critique?
I'll just say that Reitter made it much clearer than previous translations and didn't over dialecticize. And also, I'm convinced that Marx's tool for critique was not only dialectic, sorry for the dialecticians in the house, but that for him, if insults worked, or if showing someone off to be a fool worked, we don't read a lot of these political economists anymore, maybe not because of Marx, but if yelling about it worked, he was happy to do it. And you get all of those other modes of critique in Reiter's translation. It's alive to them, satire. There's like whole puppet plays of satire between a commodity that speaks and a worker that speaks and a capitalist. We return to our capitalist who's now at the market. Marx says this. And if you get it in a funny way, you realize how ridiculous it is. Ridicule, wouldn't you say, Paul? You're good at that?
Oh, I don't know. I tried.
Paul did translate Karl Kraus.
He translated Kraus and Salomon Maimon, who ridiculed himself and his whole family.
Of course, you can't translate what you don't hear. And maybe my background in German, Jewish, radical, angry, deconstructivist thinkers made me sensitive to aspects of Marx's language that the other translators, the other English translators, weren't so sensitive to. It certainly mattered to me. That tradition matters to me. And the different voices that he uses, this very aggressive style of imitation that he uses, where he sometimes will say, okay, this is an idiotic argument. If I were going to make this argument, I would do it like this. And then he develops the argument much better than it's developed by the person who actually developed the argument. But then he proceeds to show that even in the better version, it's still an idiotic argument. This is a real gutting kind of a thing. And there is even though it's very difficult to make these arguments, these kinds of arguments stick, there is a way in which it feels, as Paul said, to be like something that an outsider would cultivate more than a cultural insider. This level of critical tenacity. Paul, do you want to?
Just recommend to you before we go to questions that you read Marx's footnotes, which are full of the takedowns that you're longing for. He takes everybody down in the footnotes. It's beautiful.
So I read this last sentence and then we'll open it up from Paul Reitter's introduction, translator's introduction. If one of your priorities is to preserve the quieter moments of programmatic weirdness, you should be careful how German your translation sounds elsewhere. I'm still trying to parse that, but I love the idea of a priority that the quieter moments of programmatic weirdness that you do seem to channel very much in this text, as well as the moments of high irony and sort of dramatic, what is it called, when they have those moments of recognition. Yes, thank you. And you're right.
Good, we're both up here because we're keeping each other's memories going.
Yeah.
Middle-aged people, you'll get there.
Anyway, programmatic weirdness.
So one major translation challenge with Marx has to do with personification. As we've mentioned a couple of times, capitalism for him is this upside down world where things suck the life out of people, basically, and things do a lot of things that you would expect people to do. Capital, this automatic subject, as Paul mentioned. And so it was very important to me to make these moments of programmatic personification, which, are evoking a weird situation for him. He's trying to denaturalize capitalism, to emphasize that these situations that we've come to think of as normal situations where we're trading gelatinous blobs of our labor in the market, that these are, in fact, quite weird situations. And because German is a more personifying language than English in general, it's a big statement, but I'm making it, where you have reflexive verbs, for example, used with inanimate things so that questions raise themselves. if you follow the German very directly, then you're going to have a lot of personification, and the translation is just going to seem that the personification is just going to read like more foreignizing in a generally foreignizing translation, and not like a moment where something about the capitalist system, the upside downness of it, is being revealed. And so that's why one reason why I was very careful about not translating too directly. I wanted to avoid that general foreignizing feeling so that, again, the quieter moments of personification would be legible as such, that this is not the translation being translation-y, this is Marx being Marx. In other words, I wanted to develop some trust, or to elicit some trust from the reader, so that the reader would feel as though, okay, if there's a moment of personification here, which in a translation, especially a German to English translation, might just feel like a translation-y moment in the translation, but if the translation is otherwise moving in the direction of natural prose, and you get a moment like that, then hopefully the reader will think, okay, this is probably going on in the German. It's one of the big challenges of translation, because weird things in translation are often just assumed to be weirdness because it's a translation. Weirdness in the source text is a very hard thing to convey, and sometimes you have to do, certain things in order to convey that effectively. Here, one of the strategies was, again, to steer in the direction of natural prose, so that these moments would be, so that the reader would think, okay, this probably isn't just the translation being translation-y, this is Marx being Marx. That was the idea.
That's also why you translated in your underwear, right?
Yes, that certain atmosphere is more important. Absolutely. It's also the pandemic, so who put on pants?
How much time do we have for questions? Like about 10 minutes, I would say. Great. Andy Parker.
Thank you, Paul and Emily. I've been reading the translation, which is gorgeous. Spending all of my time though with the notes, which are just luminous. And one of the questions I've had is like, who wrote which? How did those notes come together? But it's an edition that's a translation. And you would love to hear more about how you understood the relationship between those notes.
We had two goals. One was to speak to the 20-year-old in the Midwest, and where they had questions, fill in their gaps. And the other was to make what we know of the philosophical and economic vocabulary now around value, around these weird metaphysics of capital, accessible to scholars who don't have access to German. So we wanted to be very detailed about, what might be strange to a 20-year-old, and what might have been elided in the commentary or in other translations for the scads of sociologists and English people in what field doesn't read this book, who can easily get it wrong without knowing the context. So I think the thing I'm most proud of in the last 20 years is the note on value. I won't say who wrote it. But we both wrote, we did half and half more or less, and read each other's notes and corrected and added. The funny parts in my notes are his, and the serious parts in his notes are mine.
Yeah, who put in a Harry Potter joke?
Do you know this? There's a great set, you'll find it in one of our notes. There's Marx cites an E. Potter, and Reitter calls him Herr E. Potter. It's very good. We left it in. That's how much our editor at Princeton read the manuscript. Never mind.
I just want to say that collaborating on this project with Paul was such a joy, and he's obviously so brilliant, and I learned so much talking with him, listening to him, and it really was so much fun. I know it's a big book, and if you drop it on your toe, well, don't, because you'll hurt yourself. And so it might seem like, oh goodness, this was a ton of work. And yes, of course it was, but it was a very joyful process. And that had everything to do with the collaboration and Paul's mirth throughout it. And also just all the learning from him as well was exciting. And so thank you, Paul, for working with me. I know I've said it before, I say it in the acknowledgements, but I want to say it again here at this launch moment.
Oh,
Okay, question back here.
Yeah, so obviously it's a critique of political economy, and political economy is largely British tradition. So Marx is writing in German about largely English text. I'm wondering how much you deferred to that tradition to help you with the translation, to work out like what is he talking about using these German words. With that a part of the translation. And the other thing is we have an editorial board listed at the front. I'm wondering what their role was, and was it harmonious? You know,
there's a lot of different people on that editorial
Yeah.
board, economists, but they read it and they commented all from their different perspectives and made the manuscript much better, particularly Michael Heinrich, who, if you haven't seen on YouTube, apparently there's a drinking game for every time he says value. He's really brilliant and helped us with a lot of the details of value theory.
Yeah,
But,
we had some
go ahead.
long Zoom sessions with the editorial board, like several 3-hour Zoom sessions on winter mornings. And that's a way to start the day. You know, it's like 8 a.m. on a January morning, and the meeting begins, and Michael Heinrich says, well, I have some general remarks. And then he says, on page 342 of this manuscript, paragraph 3, and we're thinking, oh my God, that's the general remark. But he was incredibly generous, and
Very helpful. On the question about the British political economists, a lot of that vocabulary stands behind the German. It's true. And we note that in the notes. We also spent an inordinate amount of time going back to the originals of the text that Marx read and putting in the original English text in the footnotes, because Marx often had the French translation of so-and-so. I can't remember their names. They have really,
Adam Smith, let's start.
well,
there.
not so much Smith. Smith, he had,
Andrew Orr,
who was it?
Andrew Orr, the tech-utopian.
Or, oh my gosh, the worst, most boring ORR. Gives you no choice but to prefer the French. But we went back and pulled out all of the original English and put it in there. So you have the sources.
So Marx sometimes translates from French translations of English sources. So you get a German translation of a French translation of an English source. And in those situations, we put in the original English source. But Marx did a lot of translating for this book. In the body of the text, he generally gives quotations in his German translations, long quotations from factory inspectors' reports and also from political economy. And he's not super reliable as a quoter or a translator. And one of the things that we tried to do in this edition was to make transparent how he works upon that source material. When he takes terms from English political economy, like original accumulation, he tends to adapt, not simply to translate. So the term that Adam Smith uses is previous accumulation, but obviously original accumulation is not simply a translation of previous accumulation. He's doing something else with it. In any case, that was a big part of this project, looking at what Marx was doing with this English source material and trying to create transparency without giving an overwhelming amount of commentary, so that readers can see that something is going on with the source material. Marx isn't just translating in a very direct way. It can be difficult to tell whether he's doing freewheeling translation or whether he's kind of massaging the evidence a little bit. I'll just give you a very quick example and then I'll stop. There are factory inspectors' reports where the English original says something like, the smell was almost unbearable. And in Marx's translation, he drops the almost and he says the smell was unbearable. So what is he doing there? Is he trying to make the situation sound even worse than the factory inspector made it out to be? Because obviously he's trying to point up how horrible working conditions are. Or is he thinking, this almost, that's an example of English understatement that doesn't translate so well. So in order to translate this effectively, I have to drop the almost. It's really.
And we went through, and where Marx modified the original text, we took out the words that he had taken out. Because otherwise you have his German translation of those texts. So imagine the crazy project that was that.
So
I'm
in
still
cases like
stuck
that,
with the gelatinous blob, and I think,
You are stuck with it.
yes, I'm
That
stuck
is
with it.
capitalism.
And I think I'm obsessing with it because I think it comes to me that I'm curious about the notion of disgust that is in there, right? It's an image of corporeal disgust, but it's used as to elicit moral disgust, right? And I find that fascinating. And I'm just curious if you encountered that here and there as you were working on the translation, that undercurrent of disgust in the imagery.
That's such a great addition to the list of ways that Marx is trying to produce a resistance to capitalism. Disgusting people, I have to add that. It's really a great contribution. He does it in a lot of ways in the book by, as Emily said, portraying workers as having their blood sucked or as their lives wasted away. It's there for sure. And I think it goes back to his original horror and disgust of reading Engels' report. Engels, who was also, he was sent to this factory by his papa. And what he sent back was, Papa, you're killing people. This is maybe edible. But the disgust, I think, for Marx was real.
Yeah, there's some many moments of dark humor in the book. He talks quite a bit about the adulteration of bread, for example, and he sets it up by saying that the good Englishman with his Bible was prepared to accept that some people would have to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow, whereas others, wouldn't have to work at all. But what he wasn't prepared to accept was that bread would have sweat in it, in addition to sweat, cockroach corpses and sawdust and lots of other things. And so there he's talking about, in this long chapter on the working day, the role that bourgeois revulsion played when the circumstances of workers came to light in driving labor reform. And in that chapter, there are many, many evocations of the filthiness, the stench of factory conditions, the food that people ate, how they ate the food, how they were forced to eat at times while they were operating noisy, dirty machines, something that he comes back to again and again.
Which is very, very much a part of the Victorian novel. Gaskell, Dickens. These are descriptions where you almost think that it's hard to know, how much the kind of back and forth in the British realist tradition of about exploitation and looking for a vocabulary of disgust.
And it's still going on in Bangladesh and Vietnam and Mexico on the border. And we don't read those novels in the same way we read Victorian novels, but there are novels about that. Plenty on YouTube.
Maybe that's a good place to stop.